You are holding a number in your head right now. Maybe you learned it in school. Maybe you saw it carved into a wall somewhere. 6 million. And that number is real, and it is shattering, and it is not even the beginning of the true cost of what happened between 1939 and 1945. The full cost is $4.1 trillion in 1945 dollars. Adjusted for today, you are looking at somewhere between 20 and 40 trillion dollars, more than the entire current GDP of the United States, spent, in 6 years, on destruction. And here's the thing, that money didn't disappear. It built something, not hospitals, not roads. It built the financial skeleton that every single person alive today is still living inside. The debt taken on to fight World War II didn't end in 1945. It mutated, it compounded, and you, yes, you specifically, are still paying interest on a war your grandparents fought. So here is the question that should rewire how you see everything. What does it actually cost to win? Go back to September 1939. Poland. The machine starts. And the first thing every government learns when a war begins is that ideology is free and everything else costs money. You can draft soldiers. You cannot draft steel. You cannot draft the aviation fuel. You cannot draft the 18 million artillery shells the Soviet Union alone will fire before it ends. Every bullet has a price. Every meal served to every soldier in every theater of a 6-year global war has a price. And someone, somewhere, has to find that money. Britain looked at its treasury and made a decision. Borrow. By 1945, British national debt had reached 250% of GDP. Winston Churchill stood before Parliament in 1940 and said, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields." What he did not say, what no leader ever says, is, "And we will be paying for it until 2006. Because that is when Britain made its final World War II debt payment to the United States. 2006. Your smartphone is newer than Britain's war debt. The United States entered late and spent fast. By 1945, federal debt had exploded from $49 billion to $260 billion, a 430% increase in 4 years. And here is the mechanism that makes this personal. The government didn't just borrow from banks. It borrowed from you. From ordinary Americans who handed over their savings in the form of war bonds, $185 billion worth. School children bought war stamps with their lunch money. Frank Sinatra performed at bond rallies in Times Square, leaning into the microphone and telling the crowd, "Buy a bond, buy two. Your country needs it more than you need a new suit." And the crowd bought. Because what else do you do when your country is on fire? The transaction seemed simple. Citizen lends money. Government fights. War. Government pays citizen back with interest. But underneath that simplicity was something that would shape every financial crisis, every government stimulus, every central bank decision for the next 80 years. The idea that a nation could fund its own survival by borrowing from its own future. And here's the thing. It worked. Which is exactly why no one ever stopped doing it. If this is the kind of story that changes how you see the world, and I promise it will, hit subscribe. Because what comes next is the part that nobody puts in the history books. The war ends. August 1945. The rubble is still warm, and 44 nations sit down in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and redesign the global financial system from scratch. The American delegate, Harry Dexter White, leans across the table and says effectively, "The dollar is the world's currency now. Everything else pegs to it, and the dollar pegs to gold. $35 per ounce. Stable, predictable, elegant, and built on one fatal assumption, that America would be disciplined. America was not disciplined. Korea, Vietnam, the space race, the Great Society programs. By 1971, the United States had printed so many dollars that the gold backing them was a polite fiction. Charles de Gaulle, the French president, was not interested in polite fictions. He called a press conference in 1965 and said, "Gold does not change its nature. It has no nationality." Then he converted $191 million into gold and sent warships to New York Harbor to physically collect it from American vaults. Other countries followed. The fiction became impossible to maintain. On August 15, 1971, Nixon sat down in front of a television camera and said, "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold." 14 words. The gold standard was over. The dollar became a promise, not backed by metal, backed by belief. And from that moment, there was no ceiling on how much debt any nation could accumulate, because there was nothing left to set the limit. Before 1971, global debt, large but bounded. After 1971, $320 trillion and climbing. The war built the machine, Nixon untethered it, and the machine has never stopped running. Now here is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because this is where the abstraction collapses into your life specifically. The Marshall Plan, America's program to rebuild Western Europe. $13 billion in 1948, roughly $160 billion today. Generous? Absolutely. Calculated? Also, absolutely. Secretary of State George Marshall stood before Harvard University in June 1947 and said, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." What he did not say, what the policy documents make clear, is that European nations would rebuild using American goods, purchased with American loans, in American dollars, which reinforced the dollar as the world's dominant currency, which allowed America to borrow more cheaply than anyone else, which it then did, for decades, without restraint. The generosity was real. The architecture underneath it was strategic. Both things are true simultaneously, and understanding that is the only way to understand how the world actually works. Germany breaks your brain completely. Germany started the war. Germany lost. And after World War I, the Allies made Germany pay. The Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations so crushing that the German economy buckled, hyperinflation destroyed the middle class, and a man named Adolf Hitler stood on street corners telling desperate people that he knew who was to blame. The Allies watched that chain of cause and effect, and after 1945, decided to try something different. The London Debt Agreement of 1953. Konrad Adenauer, the West German Chancellor, sat across the table from representatives of 21 nations and walked away with roughly half of Germany's debt canceled or restructured. One of the negotiators later described the room as one where everyone understood that punishing Germany again would punish Europe. The debt was forgiven, and the result was the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. West Germany grew at 8% per year through the 1950s. It became the engine of European recovery. The country that caused the war was given a clean slate. Meanwhile, Britain, which won, was still making payments to America in 2006. Now, before we reach the final number, drop a comment and tell me, do you think a nation can ever truly recover from a war? Or does the debt just change shape and follow it forever? Because that is exactly what happened to the Soviet Union. The USSR did not receive a clean slate. It received a Cold War instead, a decades-long arms race against the country that had just demonstrated what unlimited military spending could achieve. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reportedly told American officials in 1956, "We will bury you." He meant it as ideological prophecy. What actually buried the Soviet Union was the balance sheet. Military spending through the Cold War, a Cold War that only existed because World War II created a power vacuum in Europe that two superpowers rushed to fill, consumed the Soviet economy from the inside. The USSR dissolved in 1991. The war ended in 1945. Its financial aftershocks were still collapsing governments 46 years later. And here is where the number becomes something you cannot look away from. Total cost of World War II. Military expenditure across all nations. Roughly $4.1 trillion in 1945 dollars. Infrastructure destroyed. An additional $1 trillion. Economic disruption. Factories converted, trade routes severed, agricultural land abandoned. Incalculable. Reparations, reconstruction, the Marshall Plan, the debt service paid by every participant nation across the following decades. Add several trillion more. In today's money, the conservative estimate is $35 trillion. Some economists put it higher, spread across 6 years of fighting and 80 years of consequence. 6 years of war, 80 years of bill. The systems built in the rubble of 1945 are the same systems generating $320 trillion in global debt today. The trust placed in the dollar at Bretton Woods is the same trust that makes fiat currency function, or fail, right now. When a government borrows money today to fund a stimulus, a war, a pandemic response, it is using a mechanism refined in 1943 when Frank Sinatra told a crowd to buy bonds, when Harry Dexter White told the world to trust the dollar, when Churchill told Parliament they would fight on the beaches and quietly signed another loan agreement with Washington. You did not live through World War II, but you live inside the economy it constructed. Every treasury bond, every central bank decision, every moment a government chooses to borrow against its future rather than confront its present. That is the war continuing, in a different register, with different casualties, but continuing. The final payment on Britain's war debt was processed on December 29, 2006. A wire transfer. No ceremony. A clerk at the Treasury typed a number into a system, pressed a key, and 61 years of obligation disappeared from a ledger. Somewhere, a number ticked upward. It always does. 4.1 trillion. That was the price of winning. The interest is still compounding, and nobody, not one government, not one central bank, not one economist in any country on earth, has a convincing answer for when it stops.